You've probably heard of the human genome, the huge collection of genes inside each and every one of your cells.
This Korean discovery from 2026, because the discovery from April of 2026 is truly mind-blowing.
Primary religion of Japan, with over 107 million followers, and is designed around a set of ritual practices that connect present-day Japan.
They told us we knew where we came from, that our roots were deep, stable, unbroken, stretching back through thousands of years like a single, continuous thread. But what if that thread was cut and quietly rewoven without anyone noticing? In Korea and Japan, two nations defined by some of the most enduring cultural identities on Earth, the ground is beginning to tell a different story. Ancient DNA pulled from forgotten burials and silent bones is challenging everything we assumed about continuity. It suggests that the people who live there today may not be direct reflections of the earliest inhabitants of the Korean Peninsula or the Japanese archipelago. Instead, the past looks more like a series of arrivals, overlaps, and transformations that history never fully recorded. So, the question isn't just what happened in Korea and Japan, it's how much of that history was ever truly continuous at all. Myth versus genetics. Every nation tells itself a story about where it began. In Japan, that story is ancient and sacred. It begins not with men, but with gods. According to the Kojiki, compiled in the year 712, the islands themselves were born when the deities Izanagi and Izanami stood upon the floating bridge of heaven and stirred the ocean below with a jeweled spear. From the drops that fell, the islands of Japan were said to rise. From their divine bloodline came Amaterasu, the sun goddess, and from her descended the first emperor, Jimmu, traditionally said to have founded the imperial throne in 660 BCE, a line that, the official chronicles insist, has remained unbroken for more than 2,600 years. School children grow up reading these stories. Shrines like Ise Jingu, rebuilt every 20 years for over a millennium, mark the sacred geography of that lineage. To be Japanese, the story goes, is to belong to a heritage as old as the islands themselves, pure, continuous, eternal. In Korea, the story carries a similar weight. The legend of Dangun tells of a divine prince, son of a heavenly god and a bear woman, transformed into human form, who descended onto the slopes of Mount Baekdu and founded the kingdom of Gojoseon in 2333 BCE. For centuries, this date was inscribed in chronicles like the Samguk Yusa, written by the monk Irion in the 13th century. Even today, October 3rd is celebrated in South Korea as Gaicheonjol, the day the heavens opened.
South Korea celebrates its National Foundation Day. The holiday marks the creation of the state of Gojoseon, commonly regarded as the first Korean nation-state. Kim Mok-yeon.
Dangun is more than mythology. He is foundation. A reminder that Koreans, despite Mongol invasions, Japanese occupations, and centuries of political upheaval, have endured as one people, one blood, one language, one uninterrupted lineage stretching down from ancient times. These are not unusual stories. Almost every culture builds something like them, a tale of origin that makes the present feel rooted, a myth of continuity that gives the future a foundation. We are who we are, the stories say, because we have always been here. For most of human history, there was no way to test these claims. History was what was written down, what was remembered, what was carved into temple stones and whispered between generations. If the records said your people had lived on this land for 10,000 years, then that was the truth. There was no other lens through which to look. And so, for centuries, the people of Korea and Japan grew up believing in a seamless inheritance. The face in the mirror was, more or less, the face their ancestors had worn. The language they spoke had echoed in these valleys forever. The customs, the rituals, the sense of belonging, all of it stretched back into a distant, unquestioned past. But the past, as it turns out, is not so easily known. Beneath the soil of every village, beneath the rice fields of Kyushu and the burial mounds of Gyeongju, lay something no story could anticipate. Bones, teeth, fragments of bodies belonging to people who had once been real, people who had looked up at the same stars, whose lives history had forgotten, but whose remains still carried something extraordinary inside them, a code, a whisper, a truth. The first hints came in the late 19th century. In 1877, an American zoologist named Edward Morse, riding a train into Tokyo, glanced out the window and noticed an unusual mound of shells near Omori. When he excavated the site, he uncovered pottery and human remains belonging to a culture no one had named, the Jomon. Decades later, similar discoveries followed in Korea, where prehistoric skeletons emerged from coastal shell middens and cave sites along the peninsula, and the bones were strange.
Evidence that actual skeletons have been found in some of these giants' graves. We have accounts from 1901 where there's a report of 4 9-foot skeletons.
The skulls of these ancient inhabitants did not quite match the people who lived in those lands now. The brow ridges were heavier, the faces were broader. The proportions felt subtly, persistently wrong. Early anthropologists noted the discrepancies, but struggled to explain them. Bones, after all, can be misleading. Time changes the body. Outliers exist. Statistical noise. The myth of continuity was strong, and it would take something far more powerful than measurements to crack it open. It took the ability to read the past directly. It took DNA. The DNA that changed history. The first time scientists managed to extract usable genetic material from ancient bones, it felt almost like science fiction. For decades, researchers had assumed that DNA, fragile as it is, would simply not survive the millennia. That when a body decayed, its genetic blueprint vanished with it. The breakthrough came in 1984 when a team at Berkeley, led by Alan Wilson, successfully extracted DNA from the preserved muscle of a quagga, an extinct relative of the zebra that had died over 100 years earlier. The world of genetics changed overnight. If DNA could survive in a museum specimen, perhaps it could survive in much older remains too. Under the right conditions, cold climates, undisturbed burials, a bit of luck, tiny fragments of genetic code could endure. Trapped in teeth, locked inside the dense petrous bone of the inner ear, the hardest bone in the human body, waiting. For nearly 30 years after that first quagga sequence, progress was painfully slow. Contamination was a constant enemy. A single touch from a modern hand could ruin a sample. Then, around 2010, everything accelerated. Next-generation sequencing technology made it possible to read shattered, ancient DNA fragments at a scale once unimaginable. Svante Pääbo's team in Leipzig sequenced the Neanderthal genome. Soon after, laboratories in Copenhagen, Boston, Tokyo, and Seoul joined the race. Ancient bones that had sat in museum drawers for a century suddenly became time machines. In Japan, scientists turned their attention to the Jomon. The Jomon were the prehistoric inhabitants of the Japanese archipelago, a hunter-gatherer culture that had thrived for an astonishing length of time. Some estimates push the Jomon period back more than 15,000 years, making it one of the longest continuous cultural traditions in human history. They created some of the earliest known pottery on Earth, fragments dated to around 14,500 BCE, predating the pyramids by more than 10,000 years. They built circular villages like the famous Sanai Maruyama site in Aomori, where massive wooden pillars once supported structures whose true purpose still puzzles archaeologists. They ate seafood and chestnuts and wild boar. They decorated their bodies. They buried their dead with care, sometimes curled in fetal position, sometimes adorned with shell beads. For more than a century, it was assumed that the Jomon were the direct ancestors of the modern Japanese. That the people of today were essentially the children of those ancient hunters, evolved through time, but unbroken in lineage. The DNA told a different story. In 2019, researchers at Japan's National Museum of Nature and Science successfully sequenced the genome of a Jomon woman.
To be able to analyze massive amount of data sets, massive amount of data of DNA sequencing data. A lot of the research that's been going on over the past few years in genomics has
who had died around 3,800 years ago on Reben Island, off the coast of Hokkaido. Her remains, known as IK002, became one of the most studied ancient genomes in East Asia. When her DNA was compared to modern Japanese populations, the result was startling. The Jomon contribution to the average modern Japanese genome was real, but it was small. Estimates ranged from roughly 10 to 20% depending on the region. The vast majority, the larger share, came from somewhere else, from someone else. It was as if a great tide had swept across the islands and washed most of the original people away. In Korea, the picture was similar, though told through different bones. In 2017, researchers excavating the Yeokchi-do shell midden off the southern coast of Korea recovered remains dating back nearly 6,300 years. When their DNA was sequenced, the results echoed what had been found across the sea. The hunter-gatherers, who once roamed the forests and rivers of the Korean Peninsula like their counterparts in Japan, had been overwritten. Their genetic signature appeared in modern Koreans only in trace amounts, diluted, scattered, present in fragments rather than fullness. For the scientists involved, it was both thrilling and disturbing. The myth of continuity, that long-cherished sense of unbroken bloodline, was dissolving under the weight of evidence. But the DNA didn't just say what wasn't true. It hinted at what actually happened. Mixed in with the ancient signatures, the labs found something else, another genetic profile. Younger, stronger in modern populations, a signature pointing not to the cold forests of ancient Northeast Asia, but somewhere further south, somewhere warmer, somewhere with a different way of life. A signature carried by people who brought, alongside their tools and their language, something else. Something that would change everything. They carried seeds, the farmers who replaced a world. To understand what happened, you have to imagine a moment that occurred not in Korea or Japan, but thousands of kilometers away, in the warm, fertile basin of the Yangtze River in what is now central and southern China. It was there, perhaps as long as 9 or 10,000 years ago, that human beings first began to seriously cultivate rice. The evidence sleeps in the mud of places like Shangshan in Zhejiang province, where archaeologists in the early 2000s uncovered the world's oldest known rice remains, dated to around 9,000 BCE. Charred grains, pottery embedded with husks, the fingerprints of a revolution. A few hundred kilometers away, at a site called Hemudu, excavators in 1973 stumbled upon something even more extraordinary. Layers of preserved rice grains, wooden farming tools, and the remains of stilt houses standing above ancient wetlands. When the soil was peeled back, the rice was still golden. In places, 7,000 years had passed, and the harvest still glimmered. Wild grass had turned into crop. Crop had turned into surplus. Surplus had turned into villages, populations, and an entirely new way of being human. People no longer had to wander in search of food. They could stay, they could plant, they could store, they could grow their families larger than any hunter-gatherer band had ever managed. And as they grew, they spread. Over thousands of years, descendants of those early rice farmers moved outward, carrying their crops, their tools, and their genes. Some moved south into what is now Vietnam and Thailand. Some moved east toward the Pacific coast. And some slowly, generation by generation, century by century, moved north and east across the vast plains of China into the valleys of Manchuria and eventually onto the Korean Peninsula. They didn't arrive all at once. There was no single migration, no marching army, no dramatic conquest written into legend. It was a slow, uneven drift of human beings, sometimes just a few villages at a time, carrying their pots and seeds and farming knowledge into lands once ruled by hunters. But the consequences were enormous. Wherever rice agriculture took hold, populations exploded. A hunter-gatherer society can sustain only so many people per square kilometer. Game runs out. Forests feed only so many mouths. A rice paddy is a different kind of engine. It produces calories at a scale that hunting and gathering simply cannot match. A village of farmers can grow into a town into a region into a civilization. By around 3,500 years ago, these farming peoples had pushed deep into the Korean Peninsula. Archaeological sites like Songguk-ri in South Chungcheong province, excavated since the 1970s, reveal what their world looked like. Circular pit houses arranged in clusters, fields of rice and millet, dolmen burials marking the resting places of leaders. Korea today contains nearly 40,000 dolmens, more than 40% of all such monuments in the world, silent witnesses to a society that was rapidly transforming. With these new farmers came not just crops, but new burial rites, new pottery styles, new bronze tools, and a new genetic profile that began to mix with and increasingly replace the older hunter-gatherer ancestry of the region. Then, perhaps 2,500 years ago, they crossed the sea. The narrow stretch of water between Korea and Japan, the Korea Strait, had long been a frontier. The Jomon people of Japan had been living their forest and coast lifestyle for over 10,000 years, isolated and largely undisturbed. But around the late first millennium BCE, something changed. Newcomers arrived on the northern shores of Kyushu, near what is now Fukuoka. They brought wet rice paddies. They brought iron and bronze. They brought a new culture that archaeologists today call Yayoi, named after the Tokyo neighborhood where their distinctive pottery was first identified in 1884. The Yayoi were not a small trickle. At sites like Itazuke and Yoshinogari, archaeologists have uncovered moated villages, watchtowers, and rice paddies engineered with astonishing precision. Entire farming communities that appear in the archaeological record almost suddenly, as if dropped onto the landscape. Over the following centuries, wave after wave of migrants crossed from the Korean Peninsula into Japan, pushing their villages northward up the islands. They mixed with the Jomon, sometimes peacefully, sometimes not. They drained wetlands, raised new kinds of houses, and built societies organized around the rhythms of harvest. And as they spread, the older Jomon way of life began to fade. This is the moment ancient DNA has captured most clearly. In 2021, a major study by researchers at the University of Tokyo and Trinity College Dublin sequenced the genomes of Yayoi.
The acquisition of genetic data has undergone a phenomenal revolution in the last few years. To put that in perspective, it took the first human genome sequence
Era individuals and found exactly what the bones had hinted at, a powerful new ancestry carried by migrants whose roots trace back through Korea and ultimately to the rice-growing peoples of the Yangtze. When their genes met the Jomon genes of the Japanese islands, something new emerged, a genetic blend that would become the foundation of the modern Japanese genome. Today, when scientists analyze the DNA of an average Japanese person, they see this story written clearly. A small but significant Jomon inheritance, the lingering whisper of those ancient hunters, and a larger inheritance from the Yayoi and through them from the farmers of Korea and ultimately from the rice fields of the lower Yangtze. It is in many ways a beautiful story, a story of seeds and survival, of human ingenuity moving across continents on the strength of a single grain, but it is also a story of loss, Jomon Ainu ancestry shift. Imagine, for a moment, what it must have been like to be a Jomon child watching the first Yayoi villages rise across the river.
Yayoi period. It was here that one of the first villages to have advanced rice growing techniques. What's also interesting about this small village is surrounded by a moat.
The forests you knew, the seasonal rhythms your grandmother taught you, the songs your people had sung for 10,000 years. All of it suddenly existing alongside something unfamiliar. Strangers with different faces, different tools, different food. Fields that were carved out of land your ancestors had walked freely. A future in which your way of life would no longer be the dominant one. Some Jomon communities surely resisted, some adapted, some intermarried, some retreated north and east into mountains and forests where the rice paddies could not easily follow. Over centuries, their distinct identity faded into the broader Yayoi-descended population. Their genes survived in fragments, scattered through every modern Japanese person. But the cultural world that had produced those genes, the pottery makers, the shell mound builders, the hunters of ancient Honshu, slowly dissolved. But not entirely. In the far north, in Hokkaido and the cold islands beyond,
Hokkaido, following the island's vast network of rivers and streams, beginning at the peaks of snow-capped mountains, will navigate these waters down through the island's lush forests.
a people remained who carried something different, who looked different, who lived differently, the Ainu. For a long time, outsiders saw the Ainu as a curiosity. Their language was unrelated to Japanese, their customs were distinct, their physical features stood out. Some early scholars wondered if they were European or Proto-Caucasian, or some lost branch of humanity altogether. The Ainu themselves told stories of having always been there, of being the original people of the land. When ancient DNA studies began comparing Jomon remains to modern populations, one group stood out as carrying a remarkable amount of Jomon ancestry. It was the Ainu. Far more than the average Japanese person, far more than any other group studied, the Ainu preserved the genetic signature of those ancient hunter-gatherers. They were, in a very real sense, the closest living link to the first inhabitants of Japan. For many, this was an emotional discovery. The Ainu had spent centuries marginalized, their language suppressed, their lands taken, their identity often denied, even within Japan itself. But the bones and the DNA confirmed what the Ainu had always insisted. They were not newcomers. They were not outsiders. They were the descendants of the people who had been there first, the keepers of a world that had nearly vanished. A similar, quieter story unfolds on the Korean Peninsula. The hunter-gatherers who lived there before the spread of farming.
The hunter-gatherers that preceded them. Early farmers experienced a 50% increase in enamel defects or tooth problems, a fourfold increase in iron deficiency or anemia.
Did not leave behind a clearly identifiable modern descendant group the way the Jomon did with the Ainu. Their DNA was largely absorbed, blended, diluted into the agricultural populations that followed. Their pottery and tools sit in museums. Their bones occasionally surface in caves and burial sites. But the people they were, the cultures they built, the languages they spoke, almost all of it is gone. This is one of the quietest tragedies of human prehistory. Across the world, again and again, the same pattern repeats. Hunter-gatherer peoples who had thrived for tens of thousands of years find themselves overwhelmed by the arrival of agriculture, not always through violence, sometimes through sheer numbers, sometimes through disease, sometimes through the slow seduction of a different way of life. In Europe, ancient hunter-gatherers were largely replaced by farmers from Anatolia. In the Americas, indigenous populations were transformed by later migrations and, much later, by colonization. In East Asia, the Yangtze farmers and their descendants reshaped vast stretches of the continent and the islands beyond. The Jomon and the early Koreans were not unique in being lost. They were part of a global pattern, repeated across every continent humans have inhabited. A pattern that suggests something humbling about our species. We are not, most of us, the unbroken descendants of the first people on our lands. We are, almost all of us, the descendants of newcomers, migrants, mixers, travelers who arrived somewhere and stayed. Our family trees do not stretch into the soil. They stretch across it. Shared origin, a divided identity. Here is perhaps the most striking thing the DNA reveals. When scientists compare modern Korean and modern Japanese genomes against the broader populations of East Asia, they find something that, depending on your perspective, is either surprising or deeply intuitive. The two peoples are genetically very close, not identical. The Japanese genome carries a meaningful Jomon component that Koreans largely lack. Koreans, in turn, carry slightly different proportions of ancestry from the broader continental populations. The two are clearly distinguishable. But in the grand scheme of human genetic diversity, in a comparison that includes Europeans and Africans and South Asians and indigenous Americans, modern Koreans and modern Japanese sit remarkably close together. closer in many measurements than people from the north and south of some single nations elsewhere in the world. This closeness is not an accident. It is the direct legacy of the migration chain that built both populations. The story, as the DNA tells it, runs something like this. Farming peoples, descended from the Yangtze rice cultivators, moved north and east over thousands of years. They settled in what is now Korea, mixing with earlier inhabitants, forming the foundation of the Korean population. From the Korean Peninsula, some of those people, the ancestors of the Yayoi, crossed into Japan, where they mixed with the Jomon to form the foundation of the Japanese population. So when you look at a modern Japanese person and a modern Korean person side by side, you are, in a very real sense, looking at two branches of the same migrational tree, two outcomes of the same long journey, cousins separated by a strait of water and 2,000 years of separate history. This is, in some ways, a beautiful truth. In a world that has so often pitted neighbors against each other, in a region where the 20th century alone has brought enormous pain between Korea and Japan, the bones whisper a different message. They say, you are more alike than you have been told. But it is also a complicated truth. For people whose national identities have been built, in part, on a sense of distinction from each other, the genetic evidence can be uncomfortable. Identity is not just biology. It is language, culture, memory, history, suffering, pride. The fact that two peoples share deep ancestry does not erase the centuries of separate experience that have made them distinct. It does not erase grievances or differences, or the very real ways in which Korean and Japanese cultures have evolved into something each their own. What the DNA offers is not a flattening of identity. It is a deepening of context, a reminder that the lines we draw between peoples are always more recent and more porous than we like to believe. It is also a reminder that identity itself is an evolving thing. The people who lived in Korea 4,000 years ago would not recognize themselves in modern Koreans. The Jomon hunters of 10,000 years ago would not recognize themselves in modern Japanese. Cultures change, languages change, genes change. What we call Korean or Japanese today is a snapshot of a long, ongoing process, a still image plucked from a moving river. In another 2,000 years, the people living on these same lands may carry genes from places we cannot yet imagine. They may speak languages still being formed. They may tell stories about us, the way we now tell stories about the Jomon and the Yayoi and the early Koreans, and they may be just as surprised, just as moved, just as changed by what they discover. That is the strange gift of ancient DNA. It does not just teach us about the past, it teaches us about the nature of the present. It shows us that we are not standing at the end of history, but somewhere in the middle of it, that the story is still being written, and that, perhaps, is the deepest revelation of all. And still, the ground is not finished speaking. Every excavation, every fragment of bone, every strand of ancient DNA adds another piece to a story that refuses to stay simple. What once looked like certainty is dissolving into layers of movement, of replacement, of forgotten worlds, folded beneath the ones we know. Korea, Japan, and the wider East Asian landscape are no longer just places on a map of continuity. They are intersections of migrations we are only beginning to reconstruct, and identities we are still learning how to read. But if the past can be rewritten by something as small as a molecule, then what else have we misunderstood about where we come from? And more importantly, how much of our own story is still buried, waiting in the silence, just beneath our feet?